Okay, I'm not quite sure where everyone is today, but you guys made it, so that's important. What I want to do today is to talk about, or to provide the final in this sort of series of 4 talks about the origins of the war. We've talked about the Germans, the Soviets, the Americans and the British, and now we're going to talk about the Japanese. And again, the prehistory, that is the pre-war history of this state, just as in, for example, the Soviet case, is going to tell us a lot about how this state is going to fight this war. Not only why they get into it, but how they're going to fight it. What are the sort of factors that provoke Japanese entry into the war? A war which, after all, as historians have pointed out even very recently, in 1940 and 1941, as Japanese military and political leaders thought about the possibility of extending their war from simply what had been simply a war in and for parts of China to the rest of Southeast Asia and, in fact, across the Pacific to the United States, as they wrestled with this, there was no clear consensus. There was instead a back and forth about the feasibility and about the usefulness of going to war with the United States. It's something that's represented perhaps best by the man named Admiral Yamamoto, who was the Japanese naval strategist, who on the one hand urged the Japanese government, the Japanese cabinet, not to go to war. In essence, arguing that it would be waking a sleeping giant to go to war with the United States. But on the other hand, as part of his duties, drew up and was in fact quite proud of the plans for the attack on Pearl Harbor. That is, that what emerged in Japan in 1940 and 1941 was this sort of muddled consensus. Not a flat-out sort of unanimity of agreement to go to war, but rather a sense that all other options had been exhausted. And that, in essence, Japan now needed to go to war. That Japan now, in fact, needed to initiate war. So you have is a Japan which gets to this point because of several things. And that's what I want to highlight today. That is, in order to understand where Japan is by let's say 1930-31, when really their participation in this war begins, you have to understand a little bit about the prehistory, the pre-war history of Japan. Especially the period from about 1850 to 1910 or so. It's a little bit sort of going back in the past, but I think it's very valuable. Because it's this period that creates the strange amalgam, you might say, that is modern Japan, or at least is Japan up until 1945. Prior to 1853, Japan had enjoyed about 200 years of real isolation from the world. That is, the Japanese, under the control of a significant military and aristocratic family known as the Tokugawa. Put it up here. Tokugawa. The Tokugawa controlled the position called the shogun. That is, they were the chief, they were the leading general in the emperor's army, and by the 1600s, in fact, for a few hundred years leading up to that, since medieval times, the position of the emperor in Japan had shrunk rapidly. The emperor was still around, but the emperor was largely confined to a ceremonial capital at Kyoto. Whereas, up here in Edo, which is now basically Tokyo, the shogun, the person who was the chief general of the imperial forces, that's where real power was. The emperor was sort of a figurehead and a ceremonial figure. Up here in Edo, the shogun and the shogun's family, the Tokugawa, ruled. And they ruled in alliance with some other aristocratic families, and they ruled over other aristocratic families, especially those in the southern part of Japan. All of these aristocratic families were known as daimyo, D-A-I-M-Y-O, daimyo. Another way to think about it is to call them oligarchs. People who had enormous estates, could raise their own private armies, had warriors, had soldiers at their disposal, especially the soldiers known as samurai, who had this code called Bushido of honor and respect and duty. You have this situation up until the 1850s. And the Tokugawa shoguns had chosen, in essence, to kick out just about all foreigners and to remove all foreign influences because they saw what was going on in the rest of Asia. They saw European encroachment in India, in China, in Indonesia and Malaysia, in Burma. And they did not wish for that to happen to them. In the early 1600s, they kicked out all the Christian missionaries, forcibly reconverted all Japanese Christians. It was either, sort of renounce Christianity or die. And they kicked out all European traders, except for a small group of Dutch traders who were allowed to stay on an island just off the southern city of Nagasaki. This sort of isolation went on for about 200 years. But in 1853, that changed. And it changed because an American arrived in Edo, in Tokyo. An American named Matthew Perry, insert Chandler Bing joke here. An American named Matthew Perry, that joke's getting too old, I think. I'm just starting to show my age. I gotta find another Matthew Perry joke. Matthew Perry is an American naval officer. He's leading this fleet that is seeking to open up the Pacific to American influence. This is something that started in the 1840s. He shows up in Japan in 1853. The Americans want to have some access to Japan. There's some in the United States who think, this is going to be a great market, it's going to be a great place for us to sell American goods. For the Navy, it's simply they wanted access there for resources. Coal, places to make repair on ships, places to basically have R&R for their sailors. In 1853, Perry steams into Tokyo Bay and lands and discusses this with the shogun. His men present this very sort of barbaric picture to the Japanese. The Japanese, as you can see from this picture, this is sort of a later recreation from the 1880s, from sort of historical recreation. But this is how sort of Japanese nobles, Japanese samurai especially, were supposed to look. Very clean, very neat, clean shaven. The Americans who showed up in what the Japanese called the black ships, they were fully bearded. Their hair was matted. They hadn't washed in weeks. They were covered in coal smoke and tar and dirt and everything like that. The Japanese saw them as enormously uncivilized, but they also saw them as very powerful, especially the Tokugawa shogun, because the Americans had steamed in with these vessels, the likes of which the Japanese hadn't really seen before. They had arms. And what Matthew Perry said is, this is what we'd like. We'll give you a year to think about it. And the Americans leave. The traditional historical story, but the Americans arrive and they bring modern civilization to Japan. That's not quite true. The Americans' arrival does have something to do with the changes in Japan, but it's not that sort of an easy transition. Instead, what you have is this. Over the course of late 1853 and early 1854, the shogun meets with all of his allies, all these other oligarchs and aristocrats, and tries to formulate a plan. The shogun argues we need to accede to the Americans' demands. Let them in a little bit, because otherwise we risk war, we risk conflict that we are not prepared for. Perry, coming into Japan, had exposed the fact that these massive cannons that were ringed around the cliffs around parts of Tokyo Bay, they were actually made of wood. Perry sailed through, and of course everyone said, well, those didn't work. Those are not really a deterrent anymore. So you have the shogun and some of his allies saying, we've got to do something a little bit different here to ensure that we survive against this new potential threat, or at least sort of this power seeking influence in Japan. On the other hand, there's the hardliners, and say no. They say if you give them an inch, you'll wind up giving them much more. Perry comes back in 1854. The shogun says, yes, you can have access to Japanese ports for resupply, refueling, repairs, etc. This starts a civil war in Japan between the shogun and some of his former allies who feel that he has deserted, or that he has in essence sort of deserted his position, that he has abandoned his duty to keep Japan safe from outside influences. Let me go back for a second to this map. Because what happens is that it's a civil war largely up here in the major Japanese island of Honshu. But the Civil War and the chaos that goes on here from about 1854 until the early 1860s encourages the aristocrats, or the daimyo down here, to make their move. They had never been allies of the shogun. They had been basically subordinates to the shogun. But in the early 1860s, these groups down here, they organized, this is the name of some of these daimyo, Choshu, Haizen, Satsuma, and Tosa. They actually organized themselves and unified because they see this as their opportunity to oust the shogun and to take control of Japan, because there's chaos, civil war, and conflict up here. And that's what they do. The southern aristocrats, or southern oligarchs, gain control of Japan by 1867 by unifying, using their own armies, and defeating the shogun. They are now going to run Japan. Like the shogun, like the Tokugawa, these southern daimyo, or southern aristocrats, they have no desire to see Japan invaded or taken over, or at all influenced by these Western imperial powers. The British, the Dutch, the French, the Portuguese, all of whom still had possessions in South and Southeast Asia. The thing is, these southern daimyo are not going to stick with the approach that the Tokugawa shogun had embraced. The Tokugawa shogun basically said, we're going to choose isolation. That will keep us safe. We'll keep Japan as is. Medieval, aristocratic, tightly sort of bound off from the rest of the world. The southern oligarchs say, no, we need something completely different. Same goal, different means. Instead, what they do is they go and they, in essence, get the emperor. And they're going to put the emperor back at the center of Japanese government. The emperor and some of these southern aristocrats are going to have this close bond with many of these oligarchs and aristocrats emerging as sort of the powers behind the throne. But they take the emperor. In 1867, you have a new emperor. His given name was Mutsuhito, but for our purposes, we need to remember that he takes the name as Emperor of Meiji, M-E-I-J-I, Meiji. He'll be the emperor until 1912. Meiji is very enthusiastic because, of course, the southern aristocrats are promising, to give the emperor back some power. This period becomes known as the Meiji Restoration. In some ways, it's a revolution, but it's also a Meiji Restoration because one of the things that happens to symbolize this, is that the Tokugawa shogun restores the power, restores control over the military to the emperor. There's a ceremony in which the shogun turns over the sword. That's why it's called the restoration to power of the emperor in Japan. It's a power that he holds, but one which is dependent on his support from these southern aristocrats, these various oligarch families. And they have a specific idea. They want to put the emperor back in charge, and they want to change at least what Japan looks like. How Japan appears to the outside world. Because what they decide is that the way to keep Japan safe and sovereign and intact is not to hide from the rest of the world, but rather to demonstrate how powerful they are in the world. And in particular, to demonstrate that they are the equal to these European colonial powers in the Pacific and in Southeast Asia. That is, in essence, in order to beat them, they're going to join them. They're going to go out and adopt at least the trappings or the appearances of what they see as great power, a great power's industrial economy, military, and political structure. But there's a key element here that has to be remembered. They're going to do this, but they don't want to actually have fundamental socioeconomic change in Japan. These are oligarchs. These are aristocrats. These are not people who are Democrats in sort of the radical sense. These are not people who are open to all sorts of economic liberalization. What they want to do is they want to present a certain image to the outside world, but at the same time, within Japan, they want to continue to preserve order and hierarchy. So what's going to happen is that the Japan that emerges from the early 1870s on, is one that has this sort of dual identity. One which seeks to project to the outside world that it is a modernizing, and they even said explicitly, westernizing power. But one which at home remains very much ordered and structured and hierarchical. These guys weren't trying to preserve Japan so that everyone could have a say in running Japan. They were trying to preserve Japanese sovereignty so, of course, they could enjoy rule in Japan. And that's what we have to understand. There are things built into this Meiji Restoration, some sort of contradictions and complexities, that are going to, by the 1920s and the 1930s, present real problems for the Japanese in governing themselves. And are going to give certain groups in Japanese politics and society a disproportionate influence on what goes on and just how decisions are made. In the 1870s and the 1880s, the Japanese explore, research, basically seek out how they can become more quote-unquote Western-looking. How they can change their army, how they can build up a new navy, how they can structure their political system, how they can build industries. They send advisors and envoys and others out to the United States, to Britain, to Germany, throughout the world, basically, to get ideas. And they come back and they put together, the Meiji oligarchs, Meiji himself and his advisors, they put together a Japanese state that very much represents this dichotomy. This need to appear one way, but to preserve an existing social order. And they do it in a couple of ways. One thing that does happen in the 1870s and 1880s is that there's a very public campaign to get the Japanese, especially Japanese elites, to look different. This is a picture of Meiji taken in the early 1870s. Any distinction between this and the picture of the samurai, that sort of ideal soldier? What would be the distinctions here?
European style military dress.
Yeah, he's dressed sort of like an admiral in the French Navy or something like that.
The hair and beard, too.
The hair and beard, yes. From going to this idea that facial hair is a sign of barbarity, or a sign of an uncivilized people, now it's taken as a sign of civilization. Western dress, Western military garb, beards. There's a whole program that the Japanese, don't worry about the phrase in Japanese, it's called Bunmei Kaika, and it means civilization and enlightenment. And what it is this program to basically get the Japanese, or at least Japanese elites, to shift their appearance, to move into Western dress, to embrace Western music and culture. You see efforts to, for example, those samurai who had refused to sort of assimilate into Meiji society, they were persecuted, ultimately driven to the northern part of Japan, where many of them died of exposure or starvation. Tom Cruise did not come and rescue the samurai. Let's just stress that right now. You have this determination to present a certain image to the world. Japanese military officers and others go off to the United States and to Britain and to Germany and study at military and naval academies. Japanese students will go to universities around the world. And you can see this. This is in 1889. After they've done all of this sort of research, Japan, or the emperor, announces that there's a new constitution for Japan. It's a constitution which, unfortunately, while it takes in American and British influences, is also very strongly influenced by the German constitution. We'll talk about specifically how in a moment. But you can see here Japanese women in sort of late 19th century European, sort of Victorian outfits, the men in these military outfits, lots of facial hair, beards, mustaches, etc. There's a couple of key elements that have to be remembered about the Meiji transformation. Yes, Japan gets a constitution, but there are all sorts of restraints and restrictions built into the constitution. In the first place, the constitution is not framed as sort of an accounting of rights that everyone has. That is the way in which, for example, the American Constitution is. The American Constitution is an enumeration of rights and liberties that people have naturally. That's how it's understood. This is what people have naturally, not given to them by one person or another. This is what people have. The Japanese Constitution, and this ceremony here, is quite literally gifted to the people by the emperor. The emperor is giving them these rights and these liberties. They're not guaranteed in any sort of sense or autonomous sense. Rather, they are simply a gift of the emperor. And what's implied there, what's contained in this constitution, is that the emperor is somehow above the constitution. That the emperor could take away some of these rights and liberties granted in the constitution. That the emperor is, sort of, again, separate from the constitution. If the idea is in this country that no person is above the constitution, here the emperor quite literally is above the constitution. He's the one who gives these rights to the people. And it's a constitution which, while it creates a Japanese assembly called the Diet, D-I-E-T, it also restricts voting to a very small minority of Japanese men. Very few people in Japan before the 1920s, before the First World War, are going to have the vote. It also gives the emperor all sorts of powers over the parliament. It's a parliament which is going to be drawn largely from this oligarchy and its allies. It's a parliament where it's not the largest party represented that gets to choose who becomes a prime minister, but rather the emperor chooses who becomes a prime minister. It's a party in which the cabinet can't meet until the emperor has appointed certain people to it. If the emperor refuses to do that, which at times he does, and successive emperors will, the cabinet quite simply can't meet. But the biggest thing in the Constitution is this. The army, or the Japanese, the Japanese military is not responsible to the parliament. The Japanese military does not answer to the parliament. It must not obey the parliament. It answers only to the emperor himself. That was a part of the old German constitution that the Japanese adopted. So basically, the emperor runs the army, or the emperor and his advisors run the army and navy. It's a parliament that doesn't have a lot of enforcement powers. No matter what they vote in the Diet, if the army or the navy don't want it, it's not going to happen. If the emperor doesn't want it, it's not going to happen. Now, by and large, there aren't a lot of conflicts, at least the first 30 or 40 years of the system, because you have all of these people drawn out of the same small, narrow social group. Military officers, imperial advisors, the small group of people who are eligible to participate in politics. But that's not the only thing that's being done to sort of keep close order intact in Japan. You also have the modernization, the rapid industrialization of the Japanese economy. You have shipbuilding, electrical goods, chemical goods, huge expansion of industrially made textiles. But the government does this or orchestrates this in a very certain way. They don't want basically complete free market capitalism. They want to control who's wealthy and who's not. They don't want to have social instability. People are allowed to sort of take risks and go off and develop their own businesses and things like that. You might get all sorts of people now saying we want to have a political voice. We want to be able to vote. We want, sort of a freer parliamentary system. In order to avoid that, what the Japanese do, what the Meiji government does, is it ensures that the development of the industrial economy is only going to be in the hands of certain families too. What they do is through loans that the government makes, restrictions the government places on who can get licenses to build factories or facilities, through placing contracts only with certain groups. What's created by the early 1900s is what is known in Japan as the Zaibatsu system, Z-A-I-B-A-T-S-U. Zaibatsu basically means a cartel, or it could mean in some senses a family firm, but what it really means is that one family controls a certain sector of the Japanese industrial economy. That is, people who were already on good terms with, allied with, friends with the oligarchs, the military, the people in Japanese politics, they're the ones who get put in charge of, or basically told, you get to build a new factory. The most famous of these Zaibatsu families is the Mitsubishi. You may have heard of that name before. The Mitsubishi, they're a family who had been based in one of the southern islands, had good relationships with these southern oligarchs. They were traditionally people who had carried out trade, the very limited trade that Japan had with parts of northern China and northern Asia during the 17 and 1800s. They are favored by these southern daimyo, and in essence given the contracts, given the responsibility, urged to get into first electrical manufacturing and shipbuilding, and then of course, by the 30s and early 40s, they're building everything from planes to automobiles, trucks, things like that. And you have a bunch of these families. Ultimately, you probably have a couple hundred of these Zaibatsu families, some of which, like the Mitsubishi, are enormous conglomerates, others of which just have sort of smaller sections of the economy. But again, you have a situation in which elite control in Japan is maintained. The elites are in charge of politics, the military, the emperor controls just about everything politically and institutionally, and you have the economy in the hands of this small group of people as well. There's one other thing I should mention about the Japanese. The Japanese say, okay, or the Meiji government says, we want to look Western, we want to look powerful. They build up a huge army. They conscript Japanese peasants into the army. Japanese peasants don't like that much. They build up a navy. But they say we ought to do one other thing. If we want to demonstrate that we're like the British, or we're more like the Americans, like the Dutch and everything, we have to take the one final step, which is we have to become a colonial power, an imperial power in Asia. We have to demonstrate our superiority. This is a little blurry, I apologize for this, but I'll sort of talk you through. You can see the basic gist of it here. But basically, from the 1890s onward, the Japanese embark on colonial conquests in Southeast Asia. Again, saying that one of the things that marks you out as a great power is that you have colonies. So you have Japan willingly provoking wars in the 1890s and early 1900s to demonstrate their military and economic might and to establish themselves as among the colonial powers, not among the sort of colonized groups in Asia. To justify this, the Japanese pick up on another thing coming out of Western Europe and the United States. They pick up on the language of racial superiority and racial supremacy. They argue that among Asian peoples, the Japanese are superior, that there is a hierarchy of Asian races, with, of course, the Japanese on top. Most people in the 19th, 20th century who will argue that there is a hierarchy of races are always arguing from the position that they're at the top. No one ever argues and says, well, we're third from the bottom, but there's definitely a hierarchy of races. No one ever says that. Instead, you have the Japanese on top. They argue that this is pure Japanese race, which existed thousands of years before, which has allowed Japan to evolve and to assume this natural position of leadership in Asia. The Japanese do this sort of, have this sort of, how should I put it? Again, this sort of dual identity as a colonial power. On the one hand, they say we're superior. On the other hand, they say our role in Asia is to protect other Asians. These things sort of dovetail together. We're superior to all other Asians, so therefore we need to protect all other Asians. Sometimes even from themselves. And so in the 1890s, the Japanese go to war with the Chinese. The Japanese in particular are very interested in this area here, an area called Manchuria. M-A-N-C-H-U-R-I-A, Manchuria. It's this area that's sort of between Russia, Korea, and northeastern China. It's the area that produced the last Chinese dynasty, the Qing dynasty, had been from this area. The Manchu ethnic group had been the one that had overthrown the Ming dynasty in the 1600s. But, pardon me, the Japanese see Manchuria as a place of great economic importance to them. It has an enormous amount of coal and iron ore. In here, there's ports that allow access to the Chinese market. It's also a place where the Japanese can recruit labor. They're going to look at Korea in the same way. So in 1894-95, they go to war with China over access to Manchuria. They don't get immediate access to Manchuria. What they get is this. They get the right to build a railway in Manchuria. They get what are called concessions, like the sort the Chinese had given to other colonial powers in the late 19th and early 20th century. That is, the right to basically control a piece of China to facilitate trade, to move goods in and out. So the Japanese begin controlling this area around what's called Port Arthur in Manchuria. They begin to build a railway and begin to establish a small Japanese settlement there. Again, to facilitate mostly the movement of raw materials to Japan and finished goods from Japan into China. The Japanese interest in Manchuria stirs up the Russians. The Russians had always sort of regarded Manchuria as a sort of autonomous buffer state between themselves and China. They don't like the idea of the Japanese getting in here and starting to control even part of it. In 1904, the Japanese declare war on the Russians. And they absolutely destroy the Russians in this war. The Russian-Japanese War of 04-05 is most remarkable. Part of it is fought out on land here in Manchuria, very inconclusively. But the major military engagements take place at sea, in the North Pacific. The Japanese, in 1904, decimate the Russian Pacific Fleet, and then they wait because the Russians, humiliated, decide, well, we're just going to throw everything, and the Russians send their Arctic fleet, their North Atlantic and Arctic fleet, out in 1905. It's a fleet that has to travel all the way from the Arctic Circle out into the North Atlantic, around the southern tip of Africa, because the British say you're not allowed to use the Suez Canal, all the way out to India, to the North Pacific, and they're destroyed. The guy wrote a book about this about 50 years ago. It's called The Fleet That Had to Die. Just talking about sort of the resignation being the general character of the Russian military, ordinary soldier or sailor, they all knew it. The only defeats they inflicted on the way down was they sank 3 Scottish fishing boats as revenge against the British not allowing them to use the Suez Canal. And even then, I think it was a close run thing. But they get to the North Pacific in the spring of 1905, and the Japanese are waiting to be destroyed. They sign a peace treaty with the Russians at the end of 1905. It is actually facilitated by Theodore Roosevelt, who will win the Nobel Peace Prize for it. They sign it in, of all places, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, because I think Roosevelt liked it there. But you have a couple of significant things that come out of it. In the first place, the Japanese position in Manchuria is made even more secure. In the 1890s, they had picked up, most particularly, Formosa, or what we now think of as Taiwan, from the Chinese. They picked up this concession in Manchuria. They keep it, even though the Russians don't like it because the Russians have been defeated. The Russians are humiliated. This is the first time that an Asian power has dramatically defeated one of the 5 European great powers in modern times. Now, whether Russia actually qualified as a great power is something that even Russians at the time might have disputed. But for Japan, it's this enormous triumph. They have taken on the Russians. They have defeated them comprehensively. One result is, of course, in 1905, you get a small uprising in Russia itself. The Tsar is forced to call a parliament himself. He, eventually sort of resorts to shooting people in the streets. But there is this revolt in 1905 because the incompetence, the general inefficiency of the Tsarist regime is demonstrated by the fact that, or to many Russians, is demonstrated by the fact that the Japanese had routed them not once but twice in the North Pacific. The Japanese aren't quite done. In 1905, the Japanese declare that they are sort of the protectors of Korea, the independent kingdom of Korea. It's kind of a protection racket. The Japanese say to the Koreans, we'd like to station some troops here, we'd like to use the ports. It would be terrible if anything happened to you and your monarch, but denied us this. In 1910, the Japanese just said, basically, they say, forget it, let's just take it over. So they take over Korea. Korea is going to be a Japanese possession from 1910 through 1945. If you want to understand why relations between both halves of Korea, modern-day Korea, and Japan are tense, it's a lot due to this. The Japanese, therefore, have established this empire. They've got Korea, they've got Formosa, they've got a foothold in northern China. They've defeated the Russians. The Japanese believe that this gives them a certain position internationally. In the early 1900s, they make a naval treaty with the British, basically saying they'll respect each other's possessions in Asia. They take this as a sign that the British are beginning to sort of treat them as an equal. At the start of the First World War, Japan publicly allies itself with Britain and France. The Japanese take over the German concessions in China. They would like to have the Germans, for reasons far too complicated to explain, the Germans have actually South Pacific interests, including part of Samoa. The late 19th century, when everyone was trying to grab colonies, regardless of what people in these islands actually thought of them, the Germans managed to take part of Samoa. The Japanese took that away from them. And the Japanese thought that this alliance during the First World War, that this was going to really cement their place in the first group of powers. This is what we have to understand, is that you have a Japan which, from the late 1860s on, had been deliberately trying to assert its great power status, had made all of these changes, whether these changes were sort of superficial or deep-seated. They were designed to bring Japan to the attention of the world's great powers. And so in 1918, at the end of the war, the Japanese think they're going to be treated as one of the victor powers. When they get to the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919, though, they're not. they're not treated as one of the defeated. They're not lumped over there with the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Germans and what remains of Ottoman Turkey. But they're placed at basically the second table. You've got the big four. The Americans, the British, the French, and this is the one that drives the Japanese absolutely crazy, the Italians. The Italians started the war on the German side and switched in 1915. And the Japanese say, we didn't switch, we've been with you from the start. But they're placed in this sort of second tier. They're down there with the representatives of the British colony of India. They're down there with places like Australia and Canada, part of the British Empire. They're not given control of much of these Pacific possessions that have been taken by the Germans. For the Japanese, this is a huge insult. It's a moment in which they say, our record, our achievements in the world don't seem to matter. We are seen now as still a second-tier power. And there are several things that will happen over the course of the 1920s that will reinforce that feeling in Japan. That Japan is not being accorded its due respect as a first-rate power. Not only how they're treated at Versailles, but a couple of other things. In the early 1920s, there is an effort made at disarmament, led by the British in particular, but an idea of sort of trying to at least, if not disarm the world, cap military spending and military growth around the world. There are a series of naval conferences held in which the powers basically agree that the naval strength of various nations will be set at certain levels or certain ratios. Basically, they set a base level and they say, okay, Britain and the United States can have up to 5 times this level. The Japanese can have 2.5 times of this level. And then it sort of descends further. The French can have 2, things like that. The Japanese sign it because they feel like they have no choice. They want to be part of this sort of community, this international community. They want to be in with the League of Nations, things like that. So they feel like they have no choice. But again, they feel that they're being underrepresented, that they're being underestimated. So that's one thing. The idea that the Japanese will never be allowed, or the great powers will never allow Japan to have a navy as large as the United States and Britain have. That bothers some in Japan. You have the fact that Japan is very offended in the early 1920s when the United States and Canada and Australia and New Zealand all begin to impose quotas on Asian immigration into these countries, or in the case of the United States after 1924, to absolutely forbid any more Asian immigration. That is, all of these places dealing with post-war recessions, post-war economic downturns, all of them create or look to sort of create a scapegoat, you might say, or to appease the unemployed, people who are suffering in the post-war economy. And one of the things they do is they reach out and say it's the fault of Asian immigration. That has to be stopped. And so you have, for example, in the United States by 1924, the complete exclusion, I think it's called the Alien Exclusion Act, if I remember correctly, of 23 or 24, which forbids all further Asian migration into the United States. That is Chinese labor, Indian agriculturalists, Japanese farmers and cultivators, Japanese basically indentured workers who've been going to places like Hawaii. People who, even in Colorado, in parts of Colorado, there are fifth, or probably not by 5th generation or so, Japanese-American families, farming families, who arrived here before these exclusions were put in place. The Japanese are offended by this. What they're offended by, and this is sort of a demonstration of how the Japanese think of themselves in Asia, they're not offended by the fact that all Asians are being excluded. They're offended by the fact that they're lumped in with all the other Asians. They basically say, look, we are sort of, the superior type of Asian. We are so much above the rest of Asia that we don't even really qualify as Asians. This idea of racial supremacy within Asia, racial superiority within Asia, is firmly inbuilt in the Japanese official mind. So this is another sort of insult. It sort of reinforces some people in Japan's perceptions that they are regarded as second rate. In the late 1920s, the Japanese government will get into an economic, it's not an economic war, a significant economic conflict with the British over Japanese goods being sold throughout South and Southeast Asia. That is, British manufacturers trying desperately to recover after the war will try to recover their market share for things like cotton textiles in India. During and just after the war, the Japanese had moved in. The Japanese had more efficient manufacturing processes. The Japanese could offer lower priced, similar quality goods. In the late 1920s, British manufacturers and the British government themselves mount a real campaign to try and reduce, if not eliminate, Japanese textiles from Asian colonies, from Britain's Asian colonies. They're not exactly successful, but they are, publicly, or the Japanese are at least publicly, feeling that they're being mistreated. So you have this series of, you might say, sort of public slights that the Japanese feel they've suffered. At Versailles, at the naval conferences, restrictions on immigration, these sort of economic conflicts, basically saying the Europeans don't want to give us our rightful role, or don't want to recognize at least our rightful role. So by the end of the 1920s, you have in Japan, especially in governing circles, this real resentment over how Japan is being treated. And a growing sense that if Japan isn't going to be recognized by the other great powers as their equal, they're just going to have to take that position. Rather than trying to play the game of diplomacy and international cooperation, Japan's going to have to go it alone. Much in the same way as Hitler will be thinking about Germany in the 1930s. Forget the international system, forget international cooperation. The only way to protect yourself is to go out to an extreme on your own. So there's some in Japan already thinking that by the end of the 1920s. The Great Depression hits. Japan is actually able to come out of the Great Depression a little bit earlier than some of the other major powers in the world. The government has a fairly strict control over the economy. The government has a fairly sort of strict control of the currency. They are able to basically preside over the rapid deflation of the Japanese economy and then the rapid recovery of it. Markets still exist for Japanese goods. The Japanese can still continue to undersell European and even American producers in parts of Asia. So the Japanese are able to recover by 1931, 1932, or at least to begin their recovery earlier than anyone else around the world. The Depression has highlighted a couple of things, though. It further reinforces among Japanese businessmen, especially in this Zaibatsu, that they need more protection against the swings in the global economy. That is, if the military had already been thinking about absolute Japanese self-sufficiency, some in the Japanese industrial economy start thinking, we need ways to ensure that we don't get into this situation again, that we don't fall victim to changes in the global economy again. We need to ensure that we will always have very cheap labor and very cheap natural resources, and in essence, that we'll always have captive markets to send our goods, or to sell our goods in. So again, the Great Depression comes through, and it further reinforces this idea of perhaps Japan going it alone, and Japan accumulating enough resources to be entirely self-sufficient. These are sort of outside forces acting on Japanese elite thinking. Inside Japan in the 1920s and early 1930s, there's a couple of other developments that are important. After the First World War, there was, not only sort of successful Japanese participation in it, but also Japan's increased economic role in Asia during and after the war, that import substitution, that replacement of British manufacturers, for example, in India, that I talked about a little while ago. You have more people in Japan getting wealthy. You do have, it's almost sort of inevitably, the rise of the Zaibatsu, the rise of this industrial economy, it does ultimately create, whether the elites want it or not, it does create more economic activity. It does create new wealth. You do have people who are continuing to go abroad to Britain, to the United States, elsewhere, and coming back with ideas about Japanese political institutions. And there's growing pressure in the 1920s to liberalize both the Japanese economy and Japanese politics. Public pressure that's so great that the Japanese will actually have to open up voting dramatically in the 1920s to men and women. That there will be a greater organization of political parties now for the first time. There will be demonstrations, or calls at least, to reform the Constitution, and in particular to bring the military under the control of a much more powerful parliament. These things don't sit very well with the Japanese military or with the emperor and his advisors. That's the internal context for what's going on in Japan. If the external context is that Japan or the Japanese believe that they are being treated as an inferior, that they are being disrespected, that they need to protect themselves, make themselves wholly self-sufficient, militarily, industrially, economically, etc., then internally in Japan, these same groups who are thinking about self-sufficiency and autarky, they are also thinking about their own survival. And this is especially true in the case of the Japanese military. The Japanese Army and Navy oftentimes were at odds over military spending, over who got priority, but they were in agreement over preserving their autonomy within Japan, preserving the privileged place they had within Japan. And in fact, in the late 1920s, and then again in the early first half of the 1930s, the Japanese military, in particular the army, will see some of its younger officers not just sort of trying to lobby politicians, but actually taking violent action to demonstrate their dissatisfaction or to demonstrate their opposition to any further reform. Japanese army officers will attack reform-minded politicians several times in the early 1930s. The first time the Japanese army will basically hold this rigged court-martial for them and let them off easy. The second time that it happens, and they actually assassinate, when some officers assassinate a Japanese politician, they actually court-martial them and execute the assassins. Because the Japanese army realized things may have gotten a little too far out of control. That it's one thing to attack someone, it's another thing to kill someone, apparently. But the Japanese army realizes it's in this sort of tense situation. The army itself is very much eager to restore its place, or to, not to restore, but to preserve its place in Japanese society. And as political calls for political reform continue in the 20s and the early 30s, some of the Japanese army say the best way forward for Japan is more military conquest. And in fact, military conquest, the expansion of Japan's empire, seems to solve all of these difficulties that I've highlighted. Japan is not given adequate respect internationally. Japan is not finding international respect through participation in international or multilateral arrangements or organizations like the League of Nations. That the only way Japan maybe able to assert itself finally on the global stage is by making itself completely self-sufficient, by making itself so powerful that no one can ignore it, and that no one will dare trifle with it. So you have that vision, you have the vision of industrialists and Japanese business community who say, we need to ensure that we have access to cheap raw materials and cheap labor at all times. And then, internally in Japan, you have people around the emperor, you have people in the military, especially the army, who are saying, we need to find a way to get the pressure on us pushed back. We need to relieve this pressure for reform of politics and reform of the relationship of the army to the rest of the state. What better way to do that than to go out and engage in military ventures? Make the army the focus of people's patriotism, not the focus of people's political discontent. So by 1931, you've had the coming together of all of these strands. That Japan ought to find greater self-sufficiency, that Japanese businesses ought to have guaranteed markets and resources, and that the military could use a distraction. And the military takes it in their own hands. So the army, based here in Manchuria in 1931, stages an incident. They basically claim that Chinese troops had snuck into the Japanese-controlled area in Manchuria and blown up a railway. It's completely fabricated. Just as the Germans will be fabricating it in late August 1939, the idea that Poland was somehow thinking of invading Germany, and actually did invade Germany. Similar thing here. The Japanese create this incident. In 1931, very quickly, the army based in Manchuria, without even waiting for political guidance from home, takes over Manchuria. And the Japanese Prime Minister, Japanese cabinet members, who are all fairly close to the army, they basically ratify this decision. In 1931, Manchuria becomes a Japanese possession. Don't worry about its name, but they rename it Manchukuo. And they take this Chinese aristocrat with ties back to the last dynasty, the Qing dynasty, and they make him basically the ruler of this region. He's a puppet ruler. The Japanese control this region. But it's the Japanese army almost acting unilaterally. But the Japanese army is so powerful, so well connected, no one raises an eyelid. Instead, the Japanese army and Japanese politicians very skillfully publicize this as a measured and considered Japanese response to Chinese aggression. By 1937, the Japanese are even more convinced that they need further foreign ventures. Not only is it the fact that they are ultimately forced out, they actually resign, but they're basically forced out of the League of Nations for taking over Manchuria. They believe that this is part of a growing international effort to isolate them. There's also the fact that by 1937, the public support for the military that existed after 1931 is beginning to wane. That again, people are raising questions about the military's role in the Japanese state. In 1937, there's another incident outside Beijing involving Chinese troops and Japanese troops who were stationed in the small, basically in parts of China, as I said, there were these concessions, these areas that since really the Boxer Rebellion had been governed by Europeans or other outside powers, the Americans, even the Japanese. There's a conflict between Japanese and Chinese soldiers at a place called the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing, which the Japanese Prime Minister, who is looking for a way to sort of tamp down more efforts of political reform, is looking to ways to distract it. He takes that, and the army takes that as a provocation which requires a comprehensive response. In fact, the Chinese are quite willing to talk about it. They're quite willing to sort of have a truce. They're quite willing to see what the Japanese want in terms of compensation for this conflict that destroyed some Japanese property and killed a few soldiers. Instead, the Japanese launch a full-scale air bombardment of cities like Beijing and Shanghai, and then, with troops originally based up here in Manchuria, they invade China. Not even regarding efforts by the Chinese government under Chiang Kai-shek to negotiate or to call for to try and see if there's some way to sort of appease the Japanese. Instead, the Japanese sweep down into eastern China, notably in cities like Nanjing, site of the famous Rape of Nanjing. They kill several hundred thousand civilians, men, women, and children. They commit all sorts of atrocities, which are recorded by outside observers or by people in places like Nanjing and Shanghai. Photographs of children, the burnt bodies of children, testimonies of those who had fled, testimonies of Europeans and others who recorded what they saw in these places. These all hit international media, and the Japanese are roundly condemned. The Japanese are now basically portrayed as absolute war criminals. The Americans and others begin to throw significant financial support to the Chinese government, even as the Chinese government is forced south and ultimately west by the invading Japanese. The decision to go into China, the decision to take on China, well, it may have had some economic justification, at least in the minds of Japanese business interests. Well, it may have been justified by some in the military as, again, ratcheting up the popularity of the military, and there's no question it does. The military is right. The minute they go off and engage in something, the Japanese population tends to lose its interest in political reform and become very much attached to patriotic support of the army. The problem is that the Japanese, by 1937, getting themselves into China, begin to place themselves in an even more untenable situation, one which further reinforces their belief about the need for complete self-sufficiency. That is, international sanctions after 1937, support for the Chinese government increase. European and American support for the Chinese government, the growing American refusal to trade certain goods with China, starting with things like scrap metal and steel. Ultimately, by 1940, after the Japanese move into Vietnam, the Americans begin to embargo oil. Something like 93% of all Japanese oil came from foreign sources in the 1930s. The majority of that comes from the United States, or American companies at least. By the end of the 1930s, the Japanese have a couple of problems. They have taken China. They control much of eastern and southeastern China. They are able to take resources from there. They continue to have resources in Manchuria and Korea. But, in the first place, China is not like Manchuria. China is not like Korea. China is in some ways equivalent, or the Japanese situation in China is ultimately going to be equivalent to the German situation in the Soviet Union. That it's easy to invade and attain an initial victory, but it is very hard to consolidate your control. That is, there's always more China for the Chinese to retreat to, just as there will always be more Soviet Union for the Soviets to retreat to. We'll talk about this starting next week, but the whole German idea of blitzkrieg, lightning war, the whole German invasion model is based upon this idea that there are sort of barriers or boundaries that you can push people up against, cut them off and surround them. Whether that boundary is provided by the Soviet Army in 1939, provided by the English Channel in 1940. The problem that the Nazis have in the Soviet Union and that the Japanese have in China is that there is no boundary. Armies that are defending their territory can continue to retreat as your own supply lines grow more and more tenuous, grow lengthier, grow much less secure. So the Japanese by 1940, early 1941, they're kind of bogged down in China. Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese nationalists have retreated to Western China. They're being supplied by the Europeans and by the Americans, a little bit by air, but mostly by road from India and Burma through what's called the Burma Road. You have sanctions growing outside of China on Japan. And you have, ultimately the Japanese are going to commit 5 million soldiers simply to holding China. They've got one other problem too, and this is sort of an interesting historical sidelight, but I think it's important for understanding how the war goes for the Japanese and China. The Chinese nationalists, Chiang Kai-shek's government, is functional, how should I put it? They're dysfunctional, to put even sort of a positive spin on it. At times they're really kind of a catastrophe. The Americans, the British, they despair of getting them to do anything. But there's another group in China that manages the most concerted resistance against the Japanese, and that's the Chinese communists. In 1934, 3 years before Japan invades mainland China, or the eastern coast of China, the Chinese government under Chiang Kai-shek had driven the communists far inland to the northwest. Mao and some of his closest followers, several hundred of them, had retreated in what becomes known as the Long March. They hadn't been killed, they hadn't been imprisoned, but they had sort of gone into internal exile. When the Japanese arrive, the Chinese communists are basically intact as a small but organized body. And during the war, the Chinese communists are going to establish themselves, especially in the Chinese countryside, as the defenders of the peasants and as successful resistors against the Japanese. They'll blow up train lines, they'll sabotage Japanese buildings and facilities, they will occasionally ambush Japanese troops. They build up a reputation. Chiang Kai-shek and his government don't build up a reputation for anything except massive incompetence and waste. One of the important things is the Chinese communists are basically saved because in 1934 they're isolated in Western China. Their isolation allows them to remain intact, allows them to ultimately mount a resistance effort, and it's that resistance effort and the success of it and the public relations that go along with it that will allow the Chinese communists to very quickly, between 1945 and 1949, take over China. They build up an enormous base of support in the countryside. They demonstrate that they are protectors of the peasantry. Whether they are, in fact, or not, that's a different story. But the Chinese government, the Chinese communists, use this opportunity to make themselves a much more fundamental part of the Chinese political world. So you have the Chinese situation sort of bogging down the Japanese. You also have the fact that by early 1941, you've got significant sanctions, as I mentioned. You've also got the fact that by 1941, people in Japan are beginning to grow a little bit weary of the Chinese situation. Taking over Manchuria had been a moment of triumph. The initial conquest in China had been a moment of triumph. But by 1940, 1941, people in Japan are finding that their food's being rationed, so that the army can be kept fed and supplied. Clothing's being rationed. All sorts of entertainment is being closed down. Japan is a very gray place, as one author in Tokyo put it. In early 1941, people just seemed very drab. People just seemed exhausted. And so the Japanese government, by 1941, is thinking, well, we are international pariahs now. We're bogged down in China. We're losing popular support for the military. Perhaps what we ought to do is face the inevitable. If we're on this course now towards self-sufficiency, we might as well push forward with it as fast as possible. People won't like it, but you know what? They don't like us anyways. And we might as well do it on our own schedule. So starting in the summer of 1941, the Japanese government begins to plan this two-pronged attack, you might say, on the West. One part of it is to knock out the Americans as a force in the Pacific and ultimately put the Americans back on their heels. The other part is the conquest of much of colonial Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Burma in particular, where the British and the Dutch are in charge, and where the Japanese will find the resources that will finally enable them to be fully self-sufficient. Indonesia has oil. Malaysia has tin and copper and rubber. Burma has some oil and it has rice. Remember, it was something called the Rice Bowl of Asia. This is the massive productivity of Burmese rice farming. The Japanese identify that. That's their two-pronged thing. The American attack, the attack on Pearl Harbor, is seen as part. 2 hours before they even attack Pearl Harbor, the Japanese have already landed troops in Malaysia to attack the British colony there. This is where the Japanese are by 1941. They're stuck in China. They've got sort of international disapproval and international condemnation facing them. And they've got a further internal problem of people once again questioning the role of the military and what the military's actually gotten Japan into. So if you want to look at the timing, you want to look at why Japan embarks on a course that even some in the Japanese government think is absolutely suicidal. It's they feel that they have no choice. It's not a decision taken out of massive enthusiasm, although it will be presented that way to the Japanese people, but rather taken out of sheer necessity. That the effort to create a self-sufficient Japan has simply increased the need to create a self-sufficient Japan. Having Manchuria, having Korea, having China, that's not enough. But the actions involved in taking those have demonstrated that it's not enough. You now need this next step of eliminating American opposition and taking over Southeast Asia. They will be much more successful with a takeover in Southeast Asia than they will, despite what seems like an initial success of Pearl Harbor, than they will in eliminating the American presence in the Pacific. So starting next week, we're going to start talking about the war itself in Europe, particularly in the area between Germany and the Soviet Union. We'll be coming back to talking about Japan in the second half of this class. All right, I will see you all, and I hope I have now solved all technical questions, and will be able to post these videos on the course website this weekend.